Did you ever wonder why the American symbol of justice wears a blindfold? I've never understood that. I've always been confounded by it. I understand that it's a symbol of impartiality and that judges have to be impartial. I respect that. But do we have to wear a blindfold? And who would want a judge to be blind to knowledge? My colleague and friend, Judith Resnick, who is a brilliant scholar and law professor at Harvard Law School, has a passion for justice iconography. She's gone all over the country studying, and the world actually, studying symbols of justice. It's like her hobby. And she's written an amazing book called Representing Justice, and I've learned from her work that an American symbol of justice without a blindfold is an icon in need of an explanation. But that's not the case anywhere else in the world. It's uniquely American. The blindfold. Justice Frankfurter has warned us about the blindfold. That we have to make a distinction between a blindfold of indifference and a blindfold of impartiality. And his argument is that whether that blindfold promotes fairness or not really depends on the knowledge of the decision maker. The knowledge of the decision maker. We're talking about child welfare courts today. The knowledge of the decision maker in our child welfare court has to far exceed just knowledge of the law. That's something I want to talk about today and try to convince you to take that blindfold, throw it away. Overcome our blindness in this system to science, our blindness to evaluation, and our blindness to promoting and prioritizing child well-being. This is the forum in which we work. But I want you to think about it today in a little different way, a way that gives it even more promise and possibility than that we see right there. Think of it, our courtrooms, as a public health setting. Think about that. I want to tell you why and when that thought entered my mind. I was training a new judge many years ago, and this is a woman who started her professional career as a registered nurse. She then became a lawyer, then became a judge, and she was sitting with me. It was her first day. She was watching. At the end of the calendar, she exclaimed, "Oh my God, this is just like the emergency room." And I realized she's really right, because the families and the children we see every day come to us because everyone else and everything else has failed these families. They have more problems than we can count. Cumulative disadvantage, impoverishment, deprivation, the confounding problem of the intergenerational transmission of child maltreatment. So many problems, and they call upon us to solve those problems. We can't be blind to science. We can't even begin to understand these problems if we are blind to science. And I've learned that many of the decisions we've made in the child welfare system, if we don't understand science, we're being robbed of the opportunity to do the best that we can for these children. But sometimes if we're blind to science, we actually harm the children and the families who come before us. Let me give you an example. A 10-month-old child who becomes inconsolable at the sight of her mother. Is she missing her mom? Or is it more likely that she has memory of the trauma that her mother inflicted upon her? We now know from neuroscience research that children as young as 6 months old have memory of trauma. Children as young as 6 months old can be depressed. Science can help us answer that question. And something odd has happened to me only 2 or 3 times in my very long career, where I'm sitting on the bench, old lady, black robe, not too friendly, and a toddler runs up and wants to get in my lap, someone I've never seen before. I used to think, what a friendly little boy. He must be happy, he must be healthy, I'm just so happy to see him. But then, understanding more of the science of childhood development, I thought, oh my God, is it possible that this child has an insecure attachment? That this baby has been left in place to place with person to person? And that foundation that we all need to be healthy, of a secure and healthy attachment to a human being, is missing in his life. If I had missed that and didn't intervene, that child could be harmed for the rest of his life. But one of the things that we used to do that was really the worst, we'd have a child who'd been in care, a young child usually, who'd been in a marvelous pre-adoptive foster home for 2 years. Came time to file that termination of parental rights petition. And guess what? This happens over and over. A relative appears, a relative who's an absolute stranger to that child. What we used to do? Tear that child out of that home, tear that child away from his psychological parents and give that child to the stranger who happened to be a relative. I don't think we're doing that anymore. We certainly shouldn't. Every decision a judge makes has an effect on the child. And we need to understand science to understand and to minimize the harm that these children have already experienced. We don't want to harm them as well. We are sworn to protect them. Next is the blindness to evaluation. How do we know it works? Have you ever thought about that? How do we know what we do every day works? How do we know that the programs we use work? How do we know? This had never occurred to me, but in 1994, I received a professional gift that changed my life. I was called by the National Research Council at the National Academy of Sciences. I had just been involved in creating our domestic violence court that opened in 1992 in Dade County. And I was asked to be part of a committee, a 3-year study committee on family violence interventions. I didn't really know what the National Research Council was. I later learned that it's the largest arm of the National Academy of Sciences, and it was created during Lincoln's presidency to aid the federal government on scientific matters. So I went into the room. There was Gellis, the wonderful Susan Schechter, Fagan, Whittam, people who devoted their entire lives to studying family violence. And they said to me, how do you know this wonderful court that you're talking about that you worked to create, how do you know it works? I said, what do you mean? I'm a judge. I work in the court. We're supposed to help people, and that's what we're doing. So they were starting to, some were laughing, some were frustrated. How do you know it works? I said, well, I read your work. You know, we got experts together. I know I'm helping people every day. That's what courts do. And they persisted, and finally I realized they were absolutely right. I had no idea whatsoever if the programs I was using were helpful, if my decisions were. And from that moment on, I've been haunted. And I want each of you to be haunted as well. So I learned from these marvelous researchers that most of the programs we use, we have no idea if they work or not, because we don't study them. And there are very few that have been studied. You know what? Most of them don't make a difference one way or the other. And what really astounded me, I had no idea, that a program that was created by an intelligent group of well-meaning people could actually harm the people, the population that the program was supposed to help. So I ran home, thought, well, let's look at what's happening in Miami, and looked at the parenting classes. They weren't evidence-based. They were probably the cheapest around. There was no agreed upon curriculum or training or credentials or anything. And the worst part was, and you've heard another speaker talk about this today, you know how we measured successful completion? Attendance. You could be catatonic, but if you went 10 times, you could pass your parenting. And so I was really frightened because I had been giving parents their children back because they had that certificate. So we worked together as a community, threw them all out because I made a finding that that's not reasonable efforts. It's not reasonable efforts if the programs we're using do not work. We're sending these families up to fail. We're making their lives even worse. So we got together, we changed it. Now we're very proud of what we do. We have pre-tests, post-tests, observational tools. And for the first time in Dade County, you could go to all the sessions but still fail parenting. But that's not so bad, because then we knew you needed a more intensive intervention. And we would usually put you in something clinical, like child-parent psychotherapy. Next, blindness to child well-being. I've traveled all over the country and visited many dependency courts, and quite a few of them, I find the child is both figuratively and literally absent. The information that's imparted to the judge is through lawyers only, filtered through lawyers only. You never hear words like attachment, you never hear words like bonding, and it's not the way I think our courts should be. We created a model, quite the opposite, called the Miami Child Wellbeing Court. It's a model that has been replicated and manualized by a translational research grant from the CDC. We concentrate on well-being, and do you want to know why? Because I think a child can be safe, a child can have permanency, but a child can still have compromised well-being. And I know there's not really a definition for well-being, which is part of the problem, that we don't promote it, we don't prioritize it, but we certainly can't count it. And we have to stop in the child welfare system equating success with a number of months in care. It's not the number of months in care, it's the quality of the experience that the child has. So in our court, we ask questions about what's inside that child at every hearing. Is the child happy? Have the nightmares stopped? What's the relationship look like? Does the child have friends? Does the child feel secure? How does that child feel? What's visitation look like, and how does the child behave before and after? Questions for which you can't count the answers, but are so, so very important. And in our court system, I love to ask questions of the people in front of us, the parents. I love to talk to them. I love to find out what they've learned, because it helps me do a better job. It's where I've learned, for example, that very young moms, we have to teach them to smile at their babies. Doesn't come naturally. I needed to know that. And one of the most, I think, eloquent descriptions of the relationship came from a young mom who appeared before me. She unfortunately had been a foster child. She never had a loving, nurturing parent. And we had her in child-parent psychotherapy, about 2 months. So she came into court and I said to her, "Tell me what you've learned." And you know what she said? This was it. She said, "I learned my baby loved me." Is a description of that relationship, can it be more eloquent than that? And then we talked about what that meant. And then we all just wanted to cheer, because that was a successful day. So we need a child-centered court where science is as common as the law, where the judge asks questions, where the lawyers work together, where we don't use interventions unless we know that they work. There's a wonderful quote that I like, one of my favorite judicial quotes, written many years ago, by a friend of Charles Dickens, called "Fill the seats of justice with men who are good, but not so absolute in goodness as to forget what human frailty is." The men and women who work in our child welfare system, I think, are the finest human beings in the justice system. They're altruistic, they are kind and passionate, and they also, unfortunately, are experts in human suffering like all of us are. But in order to ameliorate that suffering, we need more and better tools. In order to stop that intergenerational transmission of child maltreatment, we need more and better tools. We need to live in a child welfare world where science and research is as common as the law, where we never send anyone to an intervention unless we've asked, does it work? And where we take every opportunity during our hearings to ask about the well-being of the child and the well-being of that relationship. Thank you.